Hi, I'm Susan. I'm from Worldpeacefull, and this is part 4 of Disaster Capitalism. So, the subject is Naomi Klein. Canadian journalist Naomi Klein coined the term disaster capitalism in her best-selling 2007 book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, in which she observes that privatisation, government deregulation, and deep cuts to social spending are often imposed after mega disasters, man-made or natural, all before victims of war or natural disaster are able to regroup and stake their claims to what is theirs. The aim of privatising government itself has existed for decades, but the attacks of September 11, 2001 accelerated the process in the United States because the Bush administration saw its war on terror as a boon for the private sector. And we've come to see through whistleblowers that this was indeed known, and there were CIA involved in 9/11. So this endless war has to be confronted, that it was created as a means of generating profit for the industrial military complex. It was also about energy interests as the defence and energy portfolios merged. You have to understand too that George Bush was with Orbusto Energy, so these are oil people. We had Dick Cheney, who headed Halliburton. So this is where industrial interests come into government, and then policy is shaped by their industrial interests. Many of those insiders were part of the Carlyle Group, James Baker, Paul Wolfowitz, I think, certainly George Bush Sr., and many heads, actually, CEOs of fast-moving consumer good companies, so multinationals, who were buying up underperforming defence contractors. So they were there, therefore, getting profit from these wars. Now, that's obviously a real disaster capitalism in the sense that they're going into countries not resolving conflict, not maintaining an international order where they are respected in respect of these higher values that the founding fathers articulated. But they're now being viewed as predatory because the capitalist drive is anchored and merged with government. So the representation shifts from we the people to national interest, which is incorporating business interests, which is economic growth, and that's how those fuse. So they can then say to the public, well, we want to make America great again. I'm using that terminology, so I'm not necessarily linking Trump to these players, but I'm just seeing that as a mantra. It's a little bit like Great Britain, it's empire. It's more associated with that. And trying to make more money because, in truth, the United States has been in massive debt. So the credit creation, the debt crisis is what's driving predatory capitalism as well. So there's a problem to be solved there. So debt relief might be a solution. We have to think differently in the way that we organise activity. We only think in a certain way. I'll bring you in another perspective just so that you can get a feel for the real shift that can happen. My homelessness situation, I could have greeted this with great fear, and I could have rushed to get, anything to survive. I'd gone through a situation of great trauma, so I had to work that through. I wasn't actually in a position to really just get on with work. But from a spiritual perspective, I followed a thread. I didn't worry about the economics of my life. In other words, having food, having shelter became secondary to solving the problem that put me there. So in the microcosm of the macrocosm, I chose truth over being right. I chose healing over suppression of the problem. Because what we'll do is go, oh, look, just forget about it, move on. Don't worry about it. Well, no, emotionally, social healing is required when you've had trauma. And trauma happens when people disconnect emotionally from one another because we're all connected. And this is something not understood. The traumas are arising from social emotional shock. So Naomi Klein talks about the shock doctrine. I'm talking about the social emotional shock that's caused through the structural violence inherent in a system of inequality that others take for granted, that others presume that you're just going to do as you're told. Others presume that they have the power and that they can force compliance because they don't respect equality or diversity. Maybe where they grew up, they didn't have that. Maybe that wasn't role modelled. They're also predominantly the ones I encountered were in the masculine and were very much power brokers. But rather than just keep going with the same consciousness, I actually started writing poetry because I was trying to solve the problem. But as I was going through my own process of trying to understand, my consciousness shifted. I started to get more and more deeper insights into the truth of matters because I was seeking truth. I wasn't interested in making myself right. I wanted to understand how this dynamic worked because my essential driver is peace. I dreamed I was teaching peace in 1998, which shifted me out of this economic or market research background. So I had an economic profession. So my life really is that microcosm. But rather than continue with business as usual, I actually chose to solve the problem, not hate the people. I shifted my consciousness to one of regarding them as a teacher, not an enemy. I started to feel inspired to look for conflict transformation. I was a Rotary Peace Fellow in Bangkok, and we were looking at conflict. We were looking at conflict resolution. We were looking at negotiation. We were looking at specific conflicts. We were looking at peace education, many things. But I kept feeling this overwhelming inspiration to look at transformation. So my life had been disrupted. It is the microcosm for sure. But rather than go into panic, I went into problem solving. It took me years and years, over a decade, to work the problem out. I realised that on some level, I had agreed I was powerless, which is where my own psychological disruption happened, where I wanted to end my life because I couldn't find an exit out of the conflict, because it was a psychological covert form of bullying that I was dealing with, which really replicates in the macrocosm. People are bullying each other all the time. They're either doing it covertly or overtly. Ultimately, it's trying to get power over. The way we would say it from a power point of view is A is trying to get power over B, one way or another. They might do it through undermining, which is a subversive type of bullying. They might do it through silence, not give you any information, withholding information. They might do it through some sort of punitive punishment, could be legal action, could be used as a threat. Could be done through exclusion, so you might be thrown out of a public space. There may be allegations trumped up against you. But ultimately, these are power plays that take place. Now, I could confront that with legal action against them, let's say. But that would just be the same consciousness that created the problem in the first place. Wouldn't it be far wiser to actually look at myself? And where I was coming to with conflict transformation was I found the work of Byron Katie. It was inspired without a doubt. I knew nothing about her. She was a person who'd gone through depression, who had awakened. Now, she saw everything as one. Everything's connected. So interconnectivity, but in a real way. She was everything. She had no fear, complete fearlessness, no thought. She recognized that thought was the creator of suffering. She said she was born, the work, I should say, was born within her, which is 4 questions and a turnaround. It's the Aussie salute there. Flies in my car. So the first question is, predatory capitalism is destroying the planet. Is it true? Yes. Can you be absolutely certain that it's true? Most people say yes. How do you feel? How do you react when you believe the thought? Concerned, worried, fearful, uncertain, isolated, etc., etc. Then you go, okay, look at the problem of predatory capitalism. Just look at capitalism without the story. What's happening? Well, activity's happening. People are buying and selling. Cars are driving. Is things collapsing right now? Well, no. It's destroying the planet. Is it destroying the planet if I look around myself right now? Well, no, it's not. That's not to say there's not destruction happening as a result of this thing, but what the work does is it anchors you into the moment, because we're projecting a future and we're projecting a past. And really, this is the same as well. But in the actual present moment, if you stay anchored in the moment, there's nothing to fear. And I often do bring myself back to that in actual fact. Then you turn it around. Predatory capitalism is not destroying the planet. I'm destroying the planet through thinking about predatory capitalism, right? So my thoughts then see a world destroying itself. Now, if all thoughts create, and we all collectively on the same page believing it's all ending, well, it ends because we are the power. That's how what you think about, you bring about. So the only reason I'm really going through this is really to get the attention of people that, fact, these are facts. And she certainly says bring the facts to the table, but just don't bring fear along with it. This is actually what has happened. This is documented X, Y, Z, and this is good research. However, it's the fear that creates the real problem, and we then go into, when we're in fear, we then attack the other party, believing we've got to stop that party. We've got to stop them so we feel safe, right? Some might remember the work before. We have to suppress them. We have to change legislation. We have to do God's work, right? In order to do that, we've got to change everything. So what I'm really suggesting here is for those who are actually the architects behind the globalization agenda, the smart cities, the economic system, who are maintaining that system, I'm just simply saying, have a pause and do the work on it. Is it true? Because we often don't do that. We get into glee clubs, and this is part of conflict resolution. We get into glee clubs and we say, I'm right, you're wrong. And we look, and Facebook does that, because you get the algorithms attract like to you. And then you think the whole world is around, everyone's agreeing with you. Well, actually, they're not. And this is why we want contrast. This is why we want debate. This is why we want democracies, because we want those contrasting viewpoints to be heard, because that can actually be the very creative edge that creates a better idea collectively. So we're working together. We're not just on bandwagons promoting self-interest, which can never work. It's a zero-sum game. It's a little bit like the ecosystem. You couldn't have trees working against the grass, working against the flowers, working against the animals. Everything has been evolved over time so that this species feeds off that species, feeds off that species. They have their own ecospheres that they work within. There's boundaries to that so that the species maximize survival. It's a very well-evolved system of companion and competition. But the competition is really just to create little boundaries. It's also to ensure natural selection and genetic strengths are sort of favoured so the species survives. Ultimately, it's about balance. The ecosystem is balanced. But when we intervene in it, because we're out of balance and we don't understand the natural system, because we're not living amongst it, we're in houses with aircon, we're totally not adapted. We talk adaptation, but we know nothing about it. We're not adapted. We're adapted to our little economic juggernaut, and we all respond to those signals, but those signals are not nature, you see, and that's where the lack of sustainability is manifesting. That's why species are dying out, because they're taking too much. We don't know the balance. When we have too much money, we then buy too much. We buy way more than we need, which is out of balance with who we are. So that's really how it's working, is what I'm trying to convey here. And so the work of Byron Katie is very handy. I wanted to throw that one in because there's always a temptation for people to fight. And it can look pretty scary when we start to explore underneath what's going on. So she goes on to say, now wars and disaster responses are so fully privatised. Klein argues that they are themselves a new market. So there's markets being made out of these conflicts. There is no need to wait until after the war for the boom. The medium is the message. These ideological changes are implemented by force despite the routine opposition to them expressed by populations across the world. If they know about the policies at all, resistance occurs because inefficiency, abuse and corruption and death cloud the sunny rhetoric offered by privatisation's loudest defenders. Still, all too often, corporate power wins. The social and environmental costs of this phenomena are what I document in these pages. Predatory capitalism goes way beyond exploiting disaster. Many ongoing crises seem to have been sustained by businesses to fuel industries in which they have a financial stake. These corporations are like vultures feeding on the body of a weakened government that must increasingly rely on the private sector to provide public services. It is surely arguable that the corporation is now fundamentally more powerful than the nation state, and that it is often the former that dictates terms to the latter. It's also the perception, as I said before in my own situation, it's the perception I'm in agreement that I'm powerless, which is where my trauma came from. But when I realised I actually wasn't powerless, and I'm comparing myself to companies that have resources of, millions, and I have nothing, and I could say, well, I'm powerless. And that's the same sort of scenario that is painted in respect of governments believing they're dwarfed by multinationals or financiers with $500 trillion in assets. So the perception is I'm powerless. I have to go with this. If they sue me or sue the country, we become broke, and then we become a banana republic, as Keating once said. Is that true? Or maybe the countries come together. You might end up forming groups, unaligned, the United Nations, remember that. You might find that you form alliances in places you didn't think to help that other party to understand that bullying is not acceptable, or we lobby for an international criminal court that actually deals with disputation, so that you're not at the mercy of corporate lawyers who have got signed agreements and you're going through some sort of corporate arbiter. There's creative ways out, and that's what I learned from my experience. Creativity just keeps coming. And you just find if you're patient and you go with the flow, you'll work it out. And it doesn't have to, homelessness, I didn't starve. I could say, I'm going to starve. I'm going to be sleeping under a tree. Well, I never did. Not one day. I've camped. But I've never been without. And yet it's a certainty. You've got no money. You've got no home. No one's really supporting you. For a good 12 months, I was just getting money when it came. It's like I helped out here, helped out there. But there was nothing secure. There was nothing permanent. I could have gone into panic. What happens if my car breaks down? Well, you have to trust that all is perfectly as it needs to be. And that's the shift in consciousness. I wasn't afraid, so I wasn't attracting to myself fearful situations. I didn't go into a rooming house. Found out they were unsafe. I didn't want to be disempowered. I made a really strong decision around that. I'm not going to be disempowered. I'm not going to be a beggar. I'm not going to ask for help. I might inquire about possibilities, but I'm not going to lower my integrity Just speak the truth. That's why I embraced homelessness, and I speak publicly about it because I have no shame around it. I understand what caused it. I know. I've had an experience, a very powerful one. And that's not to say I haven't had moments where I've been in despair. I have. But that's the journey, because fears came up. And it's the same applying for the nation state, confronting large multinationals or even large nation states who have militaries. And you might be fearful. What if our alliance breaks down? What's going to happen to our economy? They own the Reserve Bank, or, the Federal Reserve's private. What happens? What if they collapse the economy? What then? Well, you're in for an adventure. It doesn't have to turn out all tears. You may find you've got quite a lot of resiliency happening. You might find there's a lot of innovation in this country. See, it's our fears that make us compromise, where we say, well, that's the practical decision, that's the rational decision, but it's not ethical. Oh, don't worry about the ethics. We've got to be pragmatic. Remember the wheat board issue in Iraq? Bribes. We say, oh, well, that's business as usual, because we rationalise our corruption, and we say, oh, well, you've got no choice. Well, yeah, you do. You have choice. You say, no, well, I'm here to advance Australia fair. We are honest. We are ethical. We're egalitarian. And we stand with our values, because that's where the real wealth of the nation is, you see. It's not in the money. It's in the people. It's in the culture. That's where you have to develop the country, so that we have shared ethics, shared values. We're not just believing that life's all about dog eat dog and, leaving homeless people on the street. We actually take them in because they're our people. They're our family. See, it's all shift in consciousness. And then that becomes your civilization that is into well-being. And we see that in New Zealand. New Zealand's a prime example of a country that's focusing on the well-being of its people. But I can see there's undercurrents undermining this leader, because female, and she's very principled, and so is her cabinet. And that's a New Zealand character, you see. It's a culture. They have concerns. But rather than undermine, rather than seek to remove that leader, you've got to enter into the debate, the cut and thrust of the argument. You've got to be prepared to face yourself, because that's all arguments ever do, is they face you with you, and you're not comfortable because you're not in your truth. If you're in your truth, you feel quite at peace with that, and they can say whatever they want. It won't even bother you. But when we want to silence them, that's to do with something within you knowing that what you're doing is not okay. Silence a critic is going to affect my brand image. It's going to affect wealth. You'll rationalise the violence because you haven't sufficiently questioned your part. You're avoiding it because, hey, look, nothing I can do. Untrue. That's powerlessness. So again, it said, it is surely arguable that the corporation is now fundamentally more powerful than the nation state, and that it is often the former that dictates terms to the latter. This represents a profound shift in authority that has taken place over the last half century. A competing position is that the state and the multinationals rely on each other equally, and that companies are only allowed to grow so big by the self-interested largesse of politicians. State oversight is now so weak, often indeed non-existent, in both the Western world and developing countries, that corporate power can be said to have won. Yeah, but we all lose, don't we? Ultimately, if there's no limits to power, if the balance of power is skewed, then we get abuse of power happening and no one wins, not even the abuser. And they often, from a higher perspective, say that it's actually out of the love for the tyrant that you stop the tyrant, because there's been no natural limit that would have arisen to say, hey, stop. It's like bullying, stop. This is hurting me, stop. I don't want, when you do this, it makes me feel that, and what I want is to be treated with respect. So this is dialogue. This is what we call I statements in conflict resolution. It's taking back your power and saying stop. This video is saying to the governments and the corporations, stop. Stop and think. I'm saying firstly, stop and think. Think about disruption. Think about smart cities. You might say, oh, I can't. We've already invested billions, trillions. There's no way we can. If I pull out, someone else will come in and take the money. Yes, I know, but I'll give you an example. When I was offered some work at as a research analyst at a RSL, it was, they wanted me to do research into gambling. Good money. But the idea of the research was to encourage through research the gambling. So they wanted me to investigate what makes them gamble so they could get them to gamble more. So that was a negative, social negative. I had $20 in my account and I said no. Now my partner at the time would have been one of those world leaders, let's say, going, what the? Take the work. You've got no money. But because I wasn't in fear and I was confident within myself and I had a very strong ethical standard, I said no. And I know that led me to where I am today. Now you might say, well, look where you are. You're in your car recording and you're homeless. Yes, but I'm happy with me. I don't go to my grave and get on my deathbed and go, you know what, I really wish I had said no to that. CSIRO was offered a job to corporatize scientific technology. This was the dream job, you know. Robert D. Costello, I think I'd been given an opportunity to speak publicly about market research at the time. And I'd done research for DEEC. This is Robert D. Costello. He was an Australian Olympian, very famous. So I'd just done research. I was about to take off in my career. But the job at CSIRO, I questioned the manager, and it was to market genetic engineering. And I've said this one before on a previous video, a couple of them. That week, my partner got a sculpture, an iron sculpture with all these different prongs, different heights, with a twist on the end. It was metal. And it was actually emulating plant life. And the twist at the end, I'm getting flies here, was double helix, which is the building blocks of life. The deoxyribonucleic acid. Beautiful, beautiful wording, DNA. Deribonucleic acid, something like that. I chose not to interfere with nature's design because I knew that nature had perfected it over 4 billion years, and who the hell am I to come in for commercial gain without any consideration to the entire ecosystem, market genetic engineering, when I cannot figure out the knock-on effect. I could have then been responsible for species dying, for an imbalance occurring in nature, and that would have then reflected back to me as an imbalance. And I'll give you another one that's really important that you get this. Byron Katie, very wise. She's awake. She talks about getting her daughter to buy what they call ant hotels, which is ant poison. House was full of ants. Now, she did it as a demonstration. She got her daughter to buy it, poison the ants. And then she said, and then the ants came and made a nest in my hair, because it always comes back to you, what you put out. There's a lesson in that. Had I gone down that commercial track for the sake of money, which would have made me a lot of money eventually, first, you know, the money wasn't that much in the first instant, but I would have been on my way because I would have had CSIRO on my CV. But I chose ethics, and people go, crazy, go for the money. No. I made the right choice because where I am today is where I want to be. I wasn't interested in the material growth. I was actually interested in the inner growth. I wanted to know what was true. I wanted to know myself. And you can't do that unless you question. You see what I mean? It's like, and that became my fulfillment, which is why I'm not greedy and why I don't feel bitter about having no money. I don't care, because I know life gives me exactly what I'm needing. Byron Katie said that too. What you need, you have. Even if it's $2 in your account, that's all you need. That's nature. Economics is not nature. Economics is a false economy, and I mean it in the literal sense. So once you start to get the psychology and the spiritual alchemy of this is the natural harmonizing. That's what I was here to learn, because I'm a teacher of peace. And there's no way I could be I dreamed I was teaching peace. There's no way I could fulfill that destiny had I gone for the money. It would have been out of step with my purpose and my nature. Same applies at the higher levels. We have to listen inwardly very, very keenly to the truth within ourselves. That's why I've done videos and I've talked about and advised people, go in and be clear about what is true for you, because that's the best way of making decisions that are going to benefit the whole. Because if it's only benefiting special interests, even if it's just the United States, let's make America great. Well, what about the rest of the world? So do they have to suffer for you to be great? Well, then you're continuing on with an exploitative model, and it's creating opposition. So do you just surveil more? Do you collapse economies? Do you switch them off through the IT cyber? Or do you do the hard work of cultures of peace, which others have argued they want to collapse, they want to get rid of it? Let's just control, it's a lot easier. Well, no, life may have another version for you. What do they say, 2.0, 4.0, maybe it's 99.0. That's coming. Nature is the real force here, not you. It doesn't matter how much money you've got, you're still just human. The natural power is where the real power is. That's why the talisman saber was all about the supernatural power. That's the real power. But you can't just augment it with technology. You've got to actually come into harmony. And that's why I've talked about the New Earth Army, Jim Shannon, because he brought that into the US military as preventative war, as a peace strategy. It was Reagan that actually supported that unit, that New Earth Battalion, because he was interested in that. And it really could have been a direction the United States could have taken. Jim Shannon said all the military should be employed in environmental sustainability, replanting forests. And how much happier those soldiers would be out in nature, rather than learning to kill them and in horrific ways. I was described what the training was like by a special services guy. I was pretty horrified because I hadn't heard about the real detail to the training. And it's women, babies, the lot. They're not, what they're portrayed to be. It's just, as I've been informed when I've interviewed soldiers, war is about killing. Others make money off it, so they have a vested interest in keeping it. So they have to spin it to make it look like it's defense, and and on it goes. So this video is really just to provide a contrasting view, and you can choose what you believe. It's up to you. It's all good. What they say here is a competing position is that the state and the multinationals rely on each other equally, and that companies are only allowed to grow so big by the self-interested largesse of politicians. State oversight is now so weak, often indeed non-existent. So in both the Western world and developing countries, that corporate power can be said to have won, which is what I said before. I've been reading Klein since her 1991 breakthrough book, No Logo, which challenged the idea of uncontrolled global capitalism and documented the growing resistance to it. Klein spoke in Australia in the early 2000s, and her arguments resonated with me. She exposed global injustices, but instead of just attacking the individual or group at fault, she took her critique far deeper into the economic system itself. Follow the money, she argued. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, which wreaked havoc in New York State in 2012, Klein wrote how the rich would protect themselves from the less savoury effects of the economic model that made them wealthy. The shock doctors, she lamented, are readying to exploit the climate crisis. After Sandy grounded its way up America's East Coast, the New York Times referred to the Mad Max economy, a multi-million-dollar-a-year collection of industries that thrived when things got really, really bad. In her 2014 book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, Klein argues that without serious action to reduce global emissions, the world we know and love will no longer exist. There are massive forces pushing to maintain the status quo. Those making money from energy investments, dangerous hydraulic fracking is sold as the answer, despite the clear evidence of the risk it poses to the land, water, and air. Hillary Clinton's State Department strong-armed nations to embrace shale gas and employ US companies in exploiting it. The growing success of campaigns of divestments from holdings in fossil fuels is a sure sign that business as usual is frightening disaster capitalism. At its core, Klein writes, it is a crisis born of overconsumption by the comparatively wealthy, which means the world's most manic consumers are going to have to consume less. The pages that follow in this book are filled with stories of Western greed taking a devastating toll on countries and people, rendered invisible by the mainstream media. Because mainstream media is corporate and it's just pretty much promulgating the views of the dominant narrative because they're corporate interests. This is why when we lose our ABC, when it gets corporatized, when we've got political party all voting to privatize it, this is a sign that the public is being weakened, because investigative journalism is what gives us information if there's corruption happening, if these things are not in the public interest, because we're paying their wages. Our government officials are being paid by us. We have a right to know. So as they privatise, they can then turn around and say, we have no right to know. You no longer own the asset. Well, then they no longer can take the taxes. This is the social contract being redesigned. You can't just have it all your own way. People won't accept that, particularly in light that we're aware and we're educated. We know. More and more people are starting to understand. People are accessing the internet. It's not all censored yet. The will of the public will be predominant in the future, for sure. It's a matter of time, but I guess some things have to unfold until that contraction or that shift in consciousness kicks in. Goes on to say that it is vital that corporations that are causing global environmental damage be called out, as is accepting leading US environmentalist Bill McKibben's assertion that we need to view the fossil fuel industry in a new light. It has become a rogue industry, reckless like no other force on earth. However, I have expanded Klein's thesis to focus not just on environmental catastrophe, war, and the hidden costs of foreign aid, but also on what happens when the resources sector and detention centres are privatised. These two industries are thriving in the 21st century, operating with an alarming disregard for human rights. Nothing less is required, in the words of Guardian columnist George Monbiot, than a democratic mobilisation against plutocracy. So this is, in a sense, the resurrection of real democracy that's coming, because people are going to demand it because they won't feel safe, you see. And they're going to feel they're getting these rising fines because of corporatisation of police stations, We're facing more and more costs. And then we have the smart meters, which are the energy is being supplied by certainly North American companies, United Energy being one. That was the one I noticed on the smart meter. It's also some coming out of Singapore, I noticed. I sort of have a look some of them say they're Australian, but then you look at the board and you notice that there's more players involved here. So those are essential services, energy. Now, if that energy is pulsing, if it's sending out electromagnetic frequency and that can cause harm in some way, they're arguing it causes depression and anxiety and it's a form of radiation, then that needs to be investigated. If the smart meters are monitoring us through our activity in the houses, same with the LED lights, some are stating that they can thermal map housing. So we're talking surveillance capitalism here that most people don't know about. And that needs to be in the public narrative. We need to talk about these matters because we're personally impacted by them. And at some point, people are going to find out, of course, particularly with social media. So it goes on to say, of course, there is money to be made from environmental vandalism, as US journalist Mackenzie Funk details in his 2014 book, Windfall Insurers, Business People, Arctic Oil Prospectors, Private Firefighters and Entrepreneurs are all finding business models for now. The author is savvy enough to recognise that when you're on the high ground, wealthy enough, northerly enough, far enough above the sea, global warming isn't yet the existential threat that it is for an Egyptian or a Marshall or Staten Islander, so Marshall Islands. My definition of disaster has deepened to include companies that entrench a crisis and then sell themselves as the only one who can resolve it. So this is your problem, reaction, solution idea. You create the problem, people react to it, and then you offer the solution. Some are saying that climate change is the very same scenario. We have to really be critically thinking about these events that are happening and whether we're handing power over as a result of it. Resources and detention centres are just the latest in a long line of assets and institutions that have been made the instruments of unaccountable private power. Whether we call this disaster capitalism or just a product of the unavoidable excesses and inequities of capitalism itself, the end result is still a world ruled by unaccountable markets. It is not too fanciful to imagine the end point of this process being the privatisation of the natural world itself. You know, how do you meter water from the sky? During the last 10 years, I've found myself in some of the more challenging places on Earth, and the evidence before my eyes convinces me to undertake this project, to visit a range of countries that have been sites of rampant privatisation and discrimination. As a journalist and activist, I believe that bearing witness to what I see and give unequal players the right of reply contributes some balance, I like the word balance there, to the privatisation debate, rather than the false construct of balance that permeates the corporate press, which merely pits one powerful interest against another. That's not balance. A recurring preoccupation of my previous books, my Israel question, not the Palestinian question, this is the Israel question, the blogging revolution and prophets of doom, has been to uncover the untold stories behind the 24-hour news agenda. In this book, I scrutinise an economic system that thrives on ordered chaos and autocracy. Far too few reporters demand transparency or challenge capitalism, preferring instead to operate comfortably within it. But so-called embedded journalists makes seeing beyond its narrow parameters close to impossible. And I've always opposed the practice, heavily pushed by governments and the military after 9/11. It has cultivated a media that views business and political leaders as far more important than the individuals and societies affected by them. This work is an antidote to such thinking. It is my contribution to the ongoing fight against silence and complicity in our post-9/11 world. Far beyond the shock stories of torture, rendition, war, drone attacks, and disappearances that occasionally preoccupy the mainstream media, before disappearing to make room for news about the latest reality TV show, lie narratives that are routinely ignored. The effect of policies crafted in Western capitals have clear ramifications for all citizens, all around the world, but only if we care to look. This is where our empowerment is. This book considers the view from below, the experiences of people who are all too often invisible in the daily news cycle. In this introduction to his book, Heroes, John Pilger writes that citizens in the developing world are mostly framed in the West as demons or victims, a characterisation that automatically excludes perhaps the dirtiest word in modern English, imperialism. There is not a country I visited for this book in which the legacy of imperialism did not scar the landscape and the people, an injury to which the insult of omission from Western media reportage is routinely added. It is comforting to imagine that this ideology disappeared with the sepia-tinged age of the Edwardians, but this is not the case. The propaganda has simply become more sophisticated and its proponents more brazen. Besides, there have never been more money to make. There's never been more money to make. The Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist James Risen, author of the 2014 book Pay Any Price, Greed, Power and Endless War, says that $4 trillion is the best estimate for the total price tag of the war on terror, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and much of it has gone to shadowy contractors. It is one of the largest transfers of wealth in American history, and yet it has gone largely unnoticed. This book aims to rectify this omission. Predatory capitalism does not just affect the developing world. Far too often, policies that have been tried and failed in poor nations are applied in wealthier nations in a time of profound weakness. In the wake of 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, it did not take long for commentators to start calling for reform. This is code for mass privatisation that would allow big business a free hand in redeveloping the devastated area with the help of generous tax breaks. Murray McLean, Australia's former ambassador to Japan, argued that trade liberalisation was one viable solution, but he was worried that leaders would remain bogged down in policy-making malaise. His suggestions sounded benign, but they were remarkably similar to the prescriptions described by Klein in the Shock Doctrine in relation to the tsunami that bore down on Sri Lanka, among other countries, on December 26, 2004. These included public-private partnerships, these are the PPPs, worth investigating, or city deals. We can see the city deals here in Australia. If we go to the Cities and Infrastructure website of the government, federal government, it's worth having a look at these partnerships. It goes on to say flexible labour laws and the opening up of the economy to privatisation. For this book, I visited places that provided unique insights into a cashed-up world of disaster profiteers, resource hunters, war contractors and aid leechers, he says. The narrative of supposed progress is seemingly unstoppable and beyond the reach of critique. After all, who would not want to help the people of Papua New Guinea become independent through mining if this is their path to nirvana? But the fact on the ground tells us a different story. So this book looks at Pakistan and Afghanistan, Greece, Haiti and Papua New Guinea, and the hardships that they've endured, and that enriches the local elites, he's saying, and foreign entities. Since the attacks of 9/11, the geographical heart of the West War on terror has been Pakistan and Afghanistan. The role in these countries of privatised militaries and intelligence gatherers, both foreign and domestic, prompted me to visit them. This is a murky world, far away from the slick rhetoric deployed in London, Washington and Canberra, where I met muscled contractors making packets in the pursuit of profit motive that has nothing to do with democracy or freedom. These forces partly explain the successful insurgencies against Westerners in these states and Iraq. Greece has suffered under harsh economic policies more than most countries. The rise of neo-Nazi party Golden Dawn is a logical outcome of the failed economic model. The poor and refugees are especially suffering, and I report here on their plight. This leads me to the discovery of European Union complicity in the crisis and the success of anti-austerity party Syriza. Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, is still recovering from the devastating earthquake in January 2010. I observe there are collusions between multinationals, NGOs, they're non-government organisations, government officials, armed UN troops, aid groups and donors, all of whom regard the outsourcing of essential tasks to for-profit companies as progress. On 2 trips to Haiti, I witnessed what this meant for the local community. Africa should be a warning to Haiti, with the billions of dollars of aid money pouring into the continent, more than cancelled by the billions more leaving through tax evasion and multinational profits. In Papua New Guinea, one of the largest recipients of Australian aid, I investigated whether the mining boom has helped or hindered the country, particularly in the province of Bougainville. Like so many other poor nations blessed with abundant resources, Papua New Guinea is plagued by multinationals that have operated there for decades, investing billions of dollars in exploiting what lies beneath the ground, while residents recoup few tangible benefits and see little improvement in their standard of living. Meanwhile, the environmental costs have been massive and the corruption is rampant. In short, the so-called resource curse turns out to be alive and well. So part 2, the book focuses on the United States, Britain and Australia. These 3 wealthy Western states dictate economic conditions of their own creation to the world and punish the most vulnerable in their societies who dare to speak of a piece of the action, and those who oppose their economic regime. The United States and Britain have become global leaders in the privatisation of prisons and detention industries, through which millions of people have passed without any deterrent effect on criminality. Needless to say, this system has enriched favoured companies such as Serco, G4S, and I might note they're also operating here in Australia, and Corrections Corporation of America. I investigated in both countries how lobbying, ideology and a punishment ethos have colluded to produce one of the most destructive experiments in modern times, mass incarceration. Australia has privatised all of its detention centres for asylum seekers, which are now run by multinational companies. Few other countries have so comprehensively outsourced such facilities to such a small group of companies, and with so little government oversight or media scrutiny. In its remote facilities, I investigated the reality of this privatised world and its effects on refugees and staff, and what they say about a supposedly civilised nation. So Australia's lost credibility through these activities, and that's definitely the case. Amnesty and Red Cross have done reports on these detention centres that we've got, certainly breaching United Nations conventions, very much being put forward as torture, violating torture, cruelty, psychological cruelty. It's very concerning that this is happening. These are stark examples of a capitalism that has gone off the rails, though sadly they are not unrepresentative. Some argue that capitalism is inherently predatory, and this book is the case for that proposition. I would have visited Equatorial Guinea, an oil-rich African country beset by corruption and violence, or southern Sudan, the world's newest nation beset with resource conflict, ethnic strife, and Western and Chinese corporate interests. So the Chinese are brought in here because they're also buying up a lot of resources in lots of countries, and it's a form of, rather than going to war, they're actually dominating through economics. So they also must be held to account as well. In Iraq, I could have researched the Western firms that made a fortune after signing resource deals with the brutal US and Iranian-backed Baghdad regime. Or I could have investigated the growing Chinese appetite for Burmese jade, causing drug addiction and hardship for locals in Kachin state. China's rise to superpower status places its actions in the spotlight, and there's no shortage of government and private enterprises desperate to make an unethical fortune. Meanwhile, the Western food and drink multinationals forging new markets in developing countries are driving increased rates of diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. And he goes on. So I won't go through all of this. I might just pick out one other aspect. This book is a product of the post-9/11 environment. The mass expansion of the privatised surveillance state, this is key, was confirmed to the realm of science fiction before the fateful September day in 2001. Today, there are 4 million US citizens who hold top secret security clearances, of whom 500,000 are contractors. Robert Greiner, who was a CIA station chief in Islamabad, Pakistan, at the time of 9/11 attacks, said in 2010 that he believed at least half of the staff working at the CIA's counterterrorism were private contractors. This is a big issue, and this is our deep state. Former NSA employee Edward Snowden exposed the dangers of mass surveillance being managed by private enterprise when he leaked documents in 2013, providing how easy it is for firms such as Booz Allen Hamilton to view and store information on citizens. It is nothing less than a privatised modern-day Stasi. I felt that myself intuitively. It's far worse than the Stasi because they've got such full-spectrum dominance through the cyber activities, through the NBN here in Australia, the smart meters, the surveillance cameras and lights, the LED lights where they can look through those and they can record. I've been informed by someone out of court that they can record audio and visual in the walls. It's embedded technologies that are surveillance technologies that we're not informed about. That's what I was told. There's also issues of Pine Gap. I was told by another IT expert that they also pick up all our emails. He said that there's a few second delay. He said that's because it's routed through, and that's your Five Eyes. So there's a lot to learn in all of this. The claim that the world is a battlefield reflects a military ideology pursued by both Democratic and Republican administrations. Same here with, the Labor and Liberal parties. As has been detailed by investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill, this view is only bolstered by WikiLeaks documents released in 2010 that uncovered a large number of previously unreported murders committed by privatised security and intelligence forces in the Afghan and Iraq conflict zones. Those ghost figures operate in the shadows in dozens of countries, kidnapping, interrogating and killing suspects without oversight. So, we're talking about crimes here. Modern-day mercenary companies, justified by the state as essential in fighting terrorism, have been completely integrated into America's endless war. And, of course, now we're hearing reports where the terrorism is being funded via the same people funding the Clinton Foundation, funding ISIS, and we're starting to see that these things are being, orchestrated, and that has to be dealt with. Otherwise, the problem doesn't stop. The war on terror has brought untold riches to corporations keen to profit from fear. The US firm CACI, provider of interrogation to Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison, was complicit in torturing Iraqis. The world's largest aerospace company, Boeing, was implicated in extraordinary rendition flights diverting suspects for torture. Lloyd's Banking Group was found to have invested in a company that flew individuals to black sites around the world. Often the corporate state is brazen about such exploitation, as are its government associates. British Defence Secretary Philip Hammond told companies to pack their suitcases to gain construction contracts at the tail end of the NATO campaign against Libya's Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. The country is now engulfed by a civil war. Western advocates of intervention have moved on to the next conflict. It's hard to escape the conclusion that wars are often fought for the key reason of liberating new and willing markets. That's certainly the impression I've formed. And with the war on terror likely to continue for decades, there will be no shortage of new business to secure. Even the United Nations is increasingly relying on unaccountable mercenary firms such as DynCorp and G4S to companies with dubious records. In Afghanistan, the Department of Defence employs nearly 40,000 contractors. The war there is far from over. And when you talk to Afghans on the ground, and I have, they're just devastated. Their country's rubble. And the emotional scars that they carry because they lose loved ones, And then they've got the Islamic insurgency coming into the country because they were more similar to the Persians, very gentle, poetic, musical people in actual fact. But they came under the person that I know told me it was like the Dark Ages. Afghanistan went back to the Dark Ages where there was summary executions, beheadings, women couldn't go out alone, they had to full cover with chowdhury. They had no rights whatsoever. 4 men would have to testify. The woman had no say. She's condemned. If she was raped, she'd be punished. It was like crazy stuff. And this is what happens when extremism takes root. And that came out of poverty itself, and it came out of war because the children were raised in the madrasas in northern Peshawar, and they only got exposed to the Quran in Arabic. They were just reciting it but not knowing what it meant. They had no concept of family, so that becomes the Taliban. So you can see, from bad seeds, worse things happen. But you've got to understand the history of what's going on here. These things are not, furthering democracy or freedom. There might be progress for some in the sense of, what do they call it, prosperity. Yeah, they make money, but look at the misery that's left in its wake. And that has ramifications. And as I said before with Byron Katie, the Ant Hotel concept, it comes back to you. Because that's a natural law, cause and effect. What you put out comes back. This is universal law. This is not revenge or anything. It's just what happens. So it goes on to say, and I'm nearly at the end here, indeed, the battle never ends. When Washington declared war against the Islamic State in 2014, private interest emerged as the big, if largely ignored, winner. Contractors were looking for the next big meal ticket, and this could be it, said Sean McFate, a former DynCorp employee. Blackwater founder Eric Prince, now running Frontier Services Group to help China in Africa. See, they cross over. There's no allegiances here. Against Islamic militants, presumably hoping that no one would remember how disastrous the effects of Western mercenaries' activities have been since 9/11. These are not armies. These are I was told by a soldier they earn up to $1,000 a day. Now the regular soldiers get a lot less. What, $100 a day? So where are they going to go? They're going to become mercenaries, and then they're unaccountable to the public, on whose behalf they say they're fighting. Meanwhile, the erosion of democracy is met with barely a whimper from the political and media establishments. Selling of valuable assets and outsourcing of vital state services occurs because public resistance to it is so minimal. So the apathy of the public is causing this. It's allowing it because we're not putting a stop to it because we're afraid to speak up. We're frightened of, being jailed or freedom of speech violations, etc. And yet it's a duty to those very ones that people speak the truth to the best of their knowledge. This book aims to shock, provoke, and reveal a world that has developed by stealth, but also to insist that alternatives are possible. So I'll stop there, and in future videos I will start looking into solutions. I'm sort of been mapping out the issues things that are going wrong in the world, because that's also part of my own education as well. I'm learning as I'm going. So ultimately, my interest is to, firstly, in order to solve a problem, you've got to understand the nature of it. I'm not into demonising individuals. I do think there are consequences that have to happen, and accountability must be on the table here. Clearly, the corporatisation of public assets is going to collapse democracy, because they can turn around and say, well, you have no right to know, we own this. And then people are locked into higher rates of costs, and they become more pauperised. They live in more poverty, they can become more dependent, and this is the weakening that's part of a global strategy in order to control. So once we've got a handle that this is what control is about, then we have to start to say, okay, then I have to find my power. I'm not powerless. I have creativity, I've got thoughts, I can speak up, but let's do it in a way that's respectful to those other parties. Let's do it in a way that puts truth on the table, and let's come up with alternatives. Now, if there's no corresponding response to that, then you have to go off in a parallel way and do it your own way. So become the example and create your eco-village, create your free energy, your Tesla free energy, grow your own food, do what you need to do. But predominantly follow your inner voice, because that's where the real wisdom comes from. And that inner wisdom will never promote violence. Non-violence is the way forward, because all violence does is anchor the problem. It doesn't actually solve it, and it distracts. It then gives an argument to the other party to suppress the violent party, and they'll have laws in place to make sure that you get suppressed. Violence doesn't work, and it's not going to solve any problem. It just escalates the problem. So we have to have patience, we have to have wisdom, we have to have a lot of love for the other parties who are confused, and they are. So I send them love. I always have and always will, and I'm always open to assisting everybody, because we're all one. And I see you as my family, everyone, and I love everyone. I love those in GS4 or whatever it is, and Serco and Goldman Sachs. I love them. I love the banks. I love the Rothschilds. I love my government. I love all the players in that government. People go, well, how can you love them? Because I know they don't know. This is my view, and they might say, well, that's an arrogant statement. You don't know. Well, that's true too. There's truth in that as well. I don't really mean it in a disrespectful way. I guess I have my view. I'll just do the best I can, and my hope would be that I'm of service. And if bringing contrasting thoughts to the table does evoke some response, my hope is that it's constructive and it's useful in the contrast, which creates better solutions. That's what I would want for everybody, because I want us to thrive as a civilization, and I believe we have enormous potential, all of us. But we have to come together as a civilization and break down the barriers that divide us. There is no superior, there is no inferior. We are the one breath. We are the one world. We are the one beautiful civilization that's got an extraordinary future waiting for it. And I believe that we are exceptional, all of us, but we've not always lived to our fullest potential because of what we believe. So I'll leave you with that. Disaster capitalism, let's transmute it into a form of an enlightenment and a new form of organisation that sort of sits with homeostasis with the planet. We have to come into harmony with the actual Earth systems if we're to survive, is my feeling. So I hope this contribution serves you. Thanks. Bye. I love you.